I didn't know his name then, but somehow, he already knew mine. The rain tapped softly against the diner windows like fingers asking to be let in, steady and patient, the kind of late-night rhythm you stop noticing until everything else goes quiet. And that's exactly what my life had been lately. Quiet, predictable, safe in a way that felt almost too perfect, like something was waiting just outside the frame, watching, timing its entrance. And I told myself I was imagining things because that's what you do when nothing makes sense. You explain it away, you keep moving. You pretend the chill crawling up your spine is just the air conditioning set too low, not instinct, not warning, just another shift, another night, another round of refilling coffee cups for strangers who wouldn't remember my face by morning. But I remembered his, even before I knew why, even before I realized how many times our paths had already crossed without me noticing. Because once I started looking back, really looking, the pattern was there, subtle, precise, impossible to ignore. The same black car parked across the street 3 nights in a row, headlights off, but engine running. The same man sitting 2 booths over who never ordered more than water, always leaving before I could bring the check. The same feeling that someone's eyes were on me, even when I stood alone in the storage room counting tips. And every time I turned, there was nothing, just shelves and silence, and my own reflection staring back at me like I was the one who didn't belong. And maybe that should have been enough to make me run, to quit, to disappear before whatever this was found me completely. But life doesn't give you clean exits. It gives you moments you almost miss, moments that feel ordinary until they aren't. And that night started like any other, my shift ending just after midnight. The neon sign flickering behind me as I pushed through the back door into the narrow alley that smelled like wet concrete and old city air, my sneakers splashing lightly through shallow puddles as I made my way toward the parking lot. Keys already in my hand, routine guiding every step. Because routine is comfort, routine is safety. Routine is a lie you tell yourself so you don't have to think about what could go wrong. And for a second, just 1 second, everything felt normal. The distant hum of traffic, the faint buzz of streetlights overhead, the cool night air brushing against my skin, until I reached the end of the alley and stopped. Not because I saw him, not yet, but because something in me did, something quiet and sharp that whispered, this is where it changes. This is where you stop pretending, and I should have listened. I should have turned around, gone back inside, asked someone, anyone, to walk me out, but I didn't, because fear is easier to ignore when you don't have proof. And then I stepped into the parking lot, and the world shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough that I felt it in the way the air tightened, in the way the silence stretched a little too long. And that's when I saw him, standing between me and my car like he had always been there, like the space itself had shaped around him, tall, still, dressed in a dark coat that caught the faint glow of the streetlight just enough to outline the sharp lines of his figure, his posture relaxed but unmovable, like nothing in this world could force him aside. And I froze, not because he touched me, not because he said anything at first, but because I knew, deep down in a place I couldn't explain, that he wasn't a stranger, not really, not to me. And that realization settled into my chest before his voice did, low, calm, controlled in a way that made every word feel deliberate. You've been avoiding me, he said, and my breath caught because there was no anger in it, no accusation, just certainty, like he was stating a fact we both understood, and I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he had the wrong person, that I didn't know who he was, but the words didn't come out. Not when his eyes held mine with a quiet intensity that made it impossible to look away, not when he took 1 step closer, not threatening, not rushed, just enough to close the distance and erase any illusion of escape. And that's when he said it, softer this time, almost like it was meant only for me. That ends tonight, little dove. And I felt it then, not fear exactly, not entirely, something deeper, something that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts scatter because he wasn't guessing. He wasn't searching, he knew. He knew me in a way that didn't make sense, in a way that shouldn't have been possible. And for the first time since this feeling started, since the shadows began following me home, I realized the truth I had been trying so hard not to see. He hadn't just found me tonight. He had been there all along, waiting, watching, choosing the exact moment when I would finally have nowhere left to go. My fingers tightened around my keys so hard the metal edges pressed into my skin, grounding me in a way nothing else could, because if I let go, if I let my mind drift even an inch, I knew panic would take over, and something about him told me that panic was exactly what he expected, what he had seen before, what he had already accounted for, and I refused to give him that, not yet, not without understanding why this was happening, why he was here, why he was looking at me like I was not a stranger but something familiar, something already chosen. I think you have the wrong person. I managed, my voice steadier than I felt, though my heartbeat was loud enough I was certain he could hear it, each pulse echoing in my ears like a countdown I could not stop. But he did not react the way a normal person would, did not question me, did not hesitate, just tilted his head slightly as if studying something invisible beneath my words, something I could not hide. No, he said quietly, and that single word carried more certainty than anything I had ever heard, more weight than denial could push against. I never mistake you. And the way he said you made it sound specific, deliberate, like my name was written somewhere only he could see, and I swallowed, forcing myself to hold his gaze even when every instinct told me to look away, to break whatever connection this was before it settled too deep. You do not even know me, I said, because logic was the only weapon I had left. Thin and fragile but still something, still mine, but his expression did not change, not even a flicker, just that same controlled calm, like he had already played this conversation out in his head and knew exactly how it would end. Emily Carter, he replied, and the sound of my full name in his voice sent a cold ripple through me, sharp and immediate, because this was not a guess, not coincidence. This was knowledge, and suddenly every moment I had brushed aside came rushing back. The car, the man in the booth, the feeling of being watched, not random, not harmless, but intentional, precise, designed. You work nights, he continued, almost absent-mindedly, like he was reciting something simple. You leave through the back door because the front feels too crowded after midnight, and you always hold your keys like that. His eyes flicked briefly to my hand, just in case, and I stepped back before I could stop myself. One small movement that felt like reclaiming space even though he had not moved at all, not followed, not closed the distance again, just stayed exactly where he was, still blocking the path to my car without effort, without force. And that was the worst part. The way he did not need to try. The way control seemed to exist around him naturally, like gravity bending everything closer whether it wanted to or not. How do you know that? I asked, quieter now, not demanding, not strong, just needing something real to hold on to. Some explanation that did not sound like the one forming in the back of my mind. Because the truth I was starting to see was not logical, it was not safe, and it did not give me any clear way out. But he did not answer right away, his silence stretching just long enough to make me feel it, to make me wonder if the answer mattered at all, or if this had already gone too far for explanations to change anything. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, not weaker, just closer, more personal in a way that made the space between us feel smaller without him taking a single step. Because I have been watching, he said, and the honesty in it was more unsettling than any lie could have been, because he was not hiding it, not denying it, just placing it there between us like something inevitable, something that had always been leading to this moment. And I shook my head, instinctively rejecting it, rejecting him, rejecting whatever this was trying to become. That is not normal, I said, the words coming out sharper now, stronger because I needed them to be, needed to draw a line somewhere before it disappeared completely. But again, he did not react like I expected, did not apologize, did not step back, just watched me with that same unreadable expression. No, he agreed, almost thoughtfully, it is not. And, for a second, that threw me off more than anything else, because he was not pretending this was acceptable, not dressing it up as something else. He was simply stating the truth, and that honesty made it harder to fight, harder to categorize him as something simple, something I could understand and escape from. Then why? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because I needed to know, needed something that made sense, and his gaze softened just slightly, not enough to change him, but enough to shift the air between us. Because you left, he said, and my breath caught again, not from fear this time but confusion, sharp and immediate. I did not leave anything, I said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. Because this was wrong. This was all wrong. I would remember something like that. I would remember him. But the certainty in his eyes did not waver, did not even flicker. You do not remember, he said, and there was something in his voice now. Something deeper, quieter, almost like patience stretched thin over something much stronger. But you will. And that was when it hit me. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to make my chest tighten and my thoughts stumble. Because the way he said it did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise. And for the first time since I stepped into that parking lot, I realized that whatever this was, whatever he was, it was not just about tonight. It had started long before I ever noticed, and I was already further inside it than I had ever meant to be. I laughed, but it came out wrong, thin and unsteady, like my voice did not belong to me anymore, because his words did not fit into anything I understood, did not match any memory I could reach, and yet they settled somewhere deeper, somewhere instinctive, like a puzzle piece I refused to place even though it clearly belonged. You are mistaken, I said, forcing each word carefully, building a wall out of denial because it was the only thing I had left that felt solid. I have never seen you before, and that should have been enough, should have ended it, because normal people accept that. They step back, they apologize, they realize they have crossed a line. But he did none of that, just watched me with a quiet intensity that made my certainty feel fragile, like glass under pressure. You have, he said, not arguing, not pushing, just stating it like it had already happened, like my memory was the only thing missing, not the truth itself, and I shook my head harder this time, stepping to the side, testing the space, testing him, because if this was real, if he truly believed what he was saying, then there had to be a way. Past him, a way out of this moment. But the instant I shifted, he moved too, not fast, not aggressive, just one step, precise and measured, enough to remain exactly where he needed to be, directly between me and the car, like he had mapped the ground itself and knew every angle I might try. And my breath caught again, sharper now, because it was not coincidence, it was intention, and intention meant planning, and planning meant time, and time meant this had been building long before tonight. You cannot keep doing that, I said, my voice tightening despite my effort to stay calm, because something about the way he moved made it clear that this was not a spontaneous encounter. It was controlled, contained, designed to leave me exactly where I was, nowhere else. And for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his expression, not anger, not irritation, something closer to restraint, like he was holding back more than he was showing. I am not keeping you, he replied. And the contradiction in his words made my chest tighten, because everything about this felt like the opposite, felt like being held in place without a single hand touching me. I am giving you a choice, he added, softer now, and that almost made it worse, because choice implies freedom, and I could not see any path that actually led away from him. Then move, I said immediately, seizing on that word before it could disappear, because if he meant it, if there was even a fraction of truth in that statement, then he would step aside. He would prove this was not what it felt like, but he did not move, not even a fraction, just held my gaze like the answer was already obvious, like the choice he meant was not the one I was asking for, and the realization hit slowly, quietly, settling into place piece by piece. He was not offering me the option to leave. He was offering me the option to stay willingly, and something about that made my stomach drop, because it meant he believed I would, that eventually I would stop fighting, stop questioning, stop trying to escape something I did not fully understand. And I shook my head again, stepping back instead of forward this time, creating distance even though it felt useless, because distance only works when both people respect it, and he did not need to close it to control it. I am leaving, I said, firmer now, because I needed to hear it out loud, needed to anchor myself to something real before his words blurred everything else. And I turned, not toward the car, not toward him, but back toward the alley, back toward the door I had just come through. Because if one path was blocked, then I would find another. That was simple. That was logical. That was mine. And for a second, it worked. For one brief second, I felt the illusion of movement, of control returning to me, my steps quick and steady as I moved away from him, away from whatever this was trying to become, until his voice reached me again, not raised, not urgent, just there, steady and certain as ever. If you walk away now, he said, and I slowed despite myself. because something in his tone made it impossible not to listen. They will find you first, and the words stopped me completely, not because I understood them, not fully, but because of what they implied, because of what they introduced into this moment, something beyond him, something beyond my control. Entirely, and I turned back slowly, my pulse picking up again as a different kind of fear settled in, quieter but deeper. Who? I asked, the question barely more than a breath, because suddenly this was not just about him anymore, not just about being watched. It was about something else, something I had not seen coming, and his eyes softened again, just slightly, just enough to make the answer feel heavier before he even spoke it. The ones who noticed you before I could get to you, he said. And that was when the ground beneath everything I thought I understood shifted completely, because whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into tonight, it was bigger than one man standing in my way, bigger than one explanation I could reject, and for the first time, I realized that leaving might not actually mean escape. Not anymore. The word first lingered in the air longer than it should have, settling into my chest with a quiet weight that made it hard to breathe, because it was not just what he said, it was how he said it, like it had already happened, like there was no version of this where I walked away untouched, and I hated that. Hated the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up, the way my steps slowed instead of quickened, the way I turned back toward him even though every logical part of me screamed to keep going, to get inside, to lock the door and pretend none of this existed. But logic had started slipping through my fingers the moment he said my name, and now it felt like I was standing in the middle of something I did not understand, something that had rules I had never learned. You expect me to believe that, I said, but the edge in my voice had dulled, replaced by something uncertain, something searching. Because if there were others, if someone else had noticed me, then this was no longer just strange, it was dangerous in a way I could not measure, and I needed to know where the truth ended and his control began. But he did not rush to answer, did not step closer or raise his voice, just remained exactly where he was, steady and composed like the world around him could shift, and he would still stand the same. I do not expect anything, he said finally, and that calm certainty returned, the same tone that made everything feel inevitable. I am telling you what is already in motion. And that word motion made my stomach tighten, because motion meant something had started, something was moving whether I understood it or not, and I hated how little control I had over it. Then explain. I pushed, forcing myself to hold my ground this time, not stepping back, not turning away, because if I was already inside this, then running blind would not save me. Explain why anyone would be watching me. And for the first time, his gaze shifted slightly, not away, but deeper, like he was weighing how much to say, how much I could handle, and that hesitation told me more than his words could, because it meant there was more, something he was choosing to hold back, something that might change everything if he let it out too soon. Because you were not supposed to be seen, he said, and the answer made no sense at first, none at all, until it did, slowly, piece by piece, settling into a shape I could not quite grasp. That does not mean anything, I replied quickly, shaking my head as if that could clear the confusion building in my thoughts. I am not hiding from anyone. But again, he did not argue, did not correct me, just watched me like I was circling the truth without realizing it. Not intentionally, he said. And there it was again, that quiet implication that something had happened. Without my awareness, something I had missed entirely, and I felt it then, a flicker of something I could not name, not quite memory, not quite imagination, just a sensation, faint but persistent, like a shadow of a moment I should have remembered but did not, and it made my chest tighten in a different way, not fear exactly, something closer to disorientation, like the ground beneath me was not as solid as I thought. Stop talking like that, I said, more sharply than before, because I needed him to stop shaping this into something bigger, something that pulled me further in. If you know something, just say it. And for a second, I thought he would refuse, thought he would keep holding the answers, just out of reach. But instead, he took a slow breath, the first real sign that he was not entirely untouched by this moment, that there was something beneath the control, something that mattered more than he was letting on. 3 weeks ago, he began, and my pulse spiked instantly, because dates were real, dates were concrete. They meant something had actually happened. You were at the downtown station, just after 8:30. and my mind reacted before I could stop it, images flashing too. Quickly to fully form, the crowded platform, the sound of trains, the feeling of being rushed, and then something else, something quieter, a moment that slipped through the noise, and my breath hitched as I tried to catch it, to hold on to it before it disappeared again. You dropped something, he continued, his voice softer now, more deliberate, like each word was meant to guide me back to that moment. And you did not notice who picked it up. And that was it. That was the shift, the faint outline of memory sharpening just enough to feel real, the briefest flash of a hand, a presence, someone standing closer than they should have been, and my heart stuttered as I looked at him again. Really looked this time, searching for something familiar in the lines of his face, in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes never left mine, and I felt it then, not recognition, not fully, but something close enough to unsettle me completely, because if he was telling the truth, if he had been there before tonight, then this was not the beginning. It was a continuation, and the worst part was not that he had found me again, it was that I had walked away without even knowing I had left something behind. My breath came shallow as that half-formed memory pressed harder against the edges of my mind, like something trying to surface through water that would not quite clear, and I hated how close it felt, how real, because if he was right, then this was not coincidence. It was something I had already touched without knowing, something I had already walked away from, and now it was catching up to me in a way I could not ignore. What did I drop? I asked, my voice quieter now, less defensive, because denial did not feel as strong anymore, not when my own mind was starting to betray me. And for the first time since this began, his gaze shifted away from mine, just briefly, like the answer was not something he gave lightly, like it mattered more than everything else he had said so far. A silver key, he replied, and the word hit me harder than it should have, sharper, immediate, because something inside me reacted before I understood why, a flicker of recognition that sent a ripple through my chest, and I blinked, trying to steady myself, trying to place it, because I did not carry a silver key. I would remember that, something that specific, something that did not belong to my normal life. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt, because there was a gap, a small empty space where certainty should have been, and that gap was growing, stretching wider the more I tried to ignore it. That is not possible, I said quickly, but the conviction was gone, replaced by something uncertain, something that made me question my own words even as I spoke them. And he saw it. I knew he did, because his expression softened just slightly, not in triumph, not in satisfaction, but in something closer to recognition, like he had been waiting for that moment, waiting for me to start seeing it myself. You reached into your pocket, he continued, his voice calm, steady, guiding, and you realized it was not yours, but before you could react, the train arrived, and you stepped forward with everyone else, and suddenly it was there, clearer now, the rush of bodies, the noise, the pressure of movement pulling me along, and something cold in my hand, unfamiliar, out of place, and my stomach tightened as the memory snapped into place, incomplete, but undeniable. I thought it was nothing. I whispered, more to myself than to him, because that was the truth. I had dismissed it, ignored it, dropped it somewhere in the chaos without a second thought, because it did not belong to me, because it did not matter, but now it felt like the most important thing in the world. It was not nothing, he said quietly, and there was no force in his voice, no need for it, because I could already feel the weight of that truth settling in. It was never meant to reach you. And that sentence changed everything, because it meant this was not random, not accidental. It meant I had crossed into something by mistake, something that had rules I had never agreed to, and now I was standing in front of the person who understood those rules better than anyone. Then why did you not stop me? I asked, the question coming out sharper than I intended, because if he had been there, if he had seen it happen, then he could have prevented this, could have stepped in before it became whatever it was now. And for the first time, something shifted in him, subtle but real, a flicker of something heavier beneath the surface. I was not supposed to be there either, he said, and the honesty in that answer struck me in a way I did not expect, because it removed something, some layer of control I had assumed he held, and replaced it with something more complicated, something that made this feel less like a trap and more like a collision, two paths crossing where neither should have been, and that realization unsettled me more than anything else so far, because it meant this was not entirely his design, not entirely something he controlled. And if he did not control it, then who did? So now what? I asked, the words quieter, more measured, because the situation had shifted again. The fear changing shape into something more focused, more aware. What happens because of a mistake I did not even know I made? And his eyes returned to mine fully, steady, unwavering. But this time there was something else there, something deeper, something that felt less like distance and more like intention. Now, he said, his voice low and certain, you stop pretending this is still your old life. And the weight of those words settled into me slowly, pressing down in a way that made everything else feel distant. Because he was right, whether I wanted him to be or not. Something had changed. Something had already shifted before I understood it. And standing there in that quiet parking lot, with the rain still falling softly around us and the city moving on like nothing had happened, I realized the hardest truth of all. I did not know where my life had ended and this had begun, and the line between them was already gone. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt full, heavy with everything I did not understand yet. And I stood there trying to hold on to something solid, something familiar. But the more I reached for it, the more it slipped away, like my old life was already fading at the edges, and I had not even realized when it started. And I hated that feeling, hated how easily he stepped into it, how naturally he occupied the space where my certainty used to be. You do not get to decide that, I said, the words sharper now, pushing back because I needed to, because if I let him define this, then I would lose the last piece of control I had left. But he did not react the way I expected, did not argue or dismiss me, just watched me with that same steady focus, like he was waiting for me to catch up to something he already understood. I am not deciding anything, he said quietly, and there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, just fact. I am telling you what has already changed, and I shook my head again, because that was the part one could not accept, the idea that something in my life had shifted without my permission, without my awareness, that I had crossed into something simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then tell me what this is, I demanded, my voice low but firm, because if I was going to be pulled into this, then I needed more than fragments, more than half answers that left me standing in the dark. And for a moment, he did not speak, his gaze moving past me briefly, scanning the empty edges of the parking lot in a way that made my chest tighten again, because it reminded me of what he had said before, that we were not alone in this, that there were others I had not seen yet. And when his eyes returned to mine, there was a shift there, something more focused, more deliberate, like he had made a decision I was not part of. It is a message, he said, and the simplicity of that answer did not make it easier to accept. It made it worse, because messages have senders, they have meaning, they have consequences, and I had somehow become part of something meant for someone else. A message for who? I asked, my voice quieter now, because the answer mattered more than I wanted it to, and his gaze did not waver, did not soften, just held steady as he gave it to me. For me, he said, and the words settled between us with a weight I could not ignore, because that changed everything. That meant I was not the target, not originally, but I was involved now whether I wanted to be or not. And that realization made my pulse pick up again, not from panic, but from something sharper, something more focused, because if this was meant for him, then whatever was coming was connected to him, to his world, to everything I had just been told I could not walk away from. Then why am I part of it? I pressed, because that was the question that mattered most, the one that decided whether I could still find a way out. And for the first time, he stepped closer again, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to shift the space between us, to make his presence feel more immediate, more real, and I held my ground this time, even as my breath caught, because stepping back now would feel like surrender, and I was not ready to give him that. Because you touched it, he said, his voice lower now, more direct, and that makes you visible. And the word visible echoed in my mind, sharper than anything else he had said, because it meant I had been unseen before, unnoticed, safe in a way I had taken for granted, and now that had changed, permanently, completely, visible to who? I asked, even though I was not sure I wanted the answer, and he did not hesitate this time, did not soften it or delay it. To people who do not ignore mistakes, he said. And the calm way he said it made the meaning sink in deeper, because there was no drama, no exaggeration, just truth. And I felt it then, a shift in the air that had nothing to do with him, something subtle but real, like the quiet around us was not as empty as it had been a moment ago. And I glanced over my shoulder without meaning to, scanning the edges of the lot, the shadows between parked cars, the dark corners where the streetlight did not quite reach, and for the first time, I felt it clearly, not imagined, not uncertain, the awareness that this space was no longer just mine, that something beyond this conversation existed just out of view. And when I looked back at him, my voice came out softer, more controlled, because fear had settled into something steadier, something that demanded clarity instead of denial. And you think staying here with you fixes that? I said, and he held my gaze for a long second before answering, not rushing, not forcing it, just letting the truth sit there before he spoke. No, he said quietly. I know it does. And the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt, no space to argue, because whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, he understood it in a way I did not. And standing there with the rain still falling and the night pressing in around us, I realized something I had been avoiding since the moment I saw him. Leaving might not be the safest choice anymore, and staying might not be a choice at all. The certainty in his voice should have pushed me away, should have made me turn and run regardless of what he said, because no one gets to decide safety for someone else. No one gets to step into your life and redraw the lines without permission. But the problem was I could feel it now, not just in his words but in the air around us, that subtle shift that made everything sharper, every sound more deliberate. The distant hum of a car engine lingering a second too long, the faint echo of footsteps somewhere beyond the edge of the lot that did not quite match the rhythm of someone simply passing by. And I hated that I noticed it, hated that I could not unnotice it once it was there, because it meant he was not the only thing I had to consider anymore. You are asking me to trust you, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because that was what this came down to, not just fear, not just confusion, but trust. And that was something I did not give easily, not to strangers, not to men who appeared out of nowhere and spoke like they owned the space around me. And for a moment, something almost like amusement touched his expression, not mocking, not dismissive, just quiet recognition. No, he said, and that single word stopped me again, because it was not what I expected, not what I was prepared to argue against. I am asking you to pay attention, he continued, his voice low but clear. Trust comes later, and the way he said it made something shift inside me, because it removed the pressure, removed the demand, and replaced it with something else, something I could not easily reject, awareness. And I realized then that he was not trying to convince me with promises. He was presenting me with something I could verify myself if I was willing to look. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant the truth might not depend on him at all. Then what am I supposed to see? I asked. Quieter now, because the edge of defiance had softened into something sharper, something more focused, and he did not answer immediately, just tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something I could not hear. And then he stepped back, just one step, deliberate, controlled, enough to clear the direct path between me and my car. And the movement caught me off guard so completely that I did not react at first, because it contradicted everything that had happened so far, everything. That told me he would not simply let me go. Go ahead, he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, and I stared at him, searching for the catch, the hidden condition, because there had to be one. There was always one, but he just watched me, waiting, and slowly, cautiously. I turned, my steps measured as I moved toward the car, every instinct alert now, every sense heightened in a way that made the night feel different, heavier, like the shadows held more than they should. And I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushing the cool metal. And that was when I felt it, not something I saw, not something I could point to, just a presence, a shift in the space behind me that made the back of my neck tighten, the unmistakable awareness that I was not alone in the way I had assumed. And I froze, my breath catching as I resisted the urge to turn too quickly, because something told me that sudden movement mattered, that being watched was not just a feeling anymore. And slowly, carefully, I glanced toward the far edge of the lot, toward the darker stretch where the streetlight faded into shadow, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something, a shape that did not quite belong, a stillness that did not match the rest of the world. And then it was gone, or maybe it had never been there at all, but the feeling remained, sharp and undeniable, and I turned back to him, my pulse steady but faster now, my mind racing in a different way than before, because this was not just about his words anymore. It was about what I had just felt for myself. You knew, I said, not accusing, just stating it. Because it was clear now, he had not been blocking my path. He had been showing me something, guiding me to see it on my own. And he met my gaze without hesitation, without triumph, just that same steady certainty. I told you, he replied, and the simplicity of it made my chest tighten, because it meant he had been honest from the beginning, not in the way I wanted, not in the way that made things easier, but in the way that left no room to hide from the truth. And I looked back toward the shadows one more time, feeling that quiet awareness settle deeper, no longer something I could dismiss, no longer something I could ignore. And when I turned back to him again, something had shifted inside me, not trust, not yet, but something close, something that acknowledged reality instead of fighting it. If I stay, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, this does not stop, does it? And he did not pretend otherwise, did not soften the answer, just held my gaze as he gave it to me. No, he said quietly, but it changes, and the weight of that settled between us. Because it was not a promise of safety, it was a promise of something else, something controlled, something directed, something I might survive if I understood it in time. And standing there with the rain still falling and the night pressing closer around us, I realized the choice in front of me was not between staying and leaving. It was between understanding and walking blind into something I could no longer pretend did not exist. I did not answer him right away because something inside me had already started shifting, quietly but completely, like a door I had not noticed before was slowly opening. And I stood there with my hand still resting against the cold metal of my car, feeling the weight of everything he had said settle into something real, something I could not push away anymore. And the hardest part was not that I believed him, not fully, but that I believed what I had felt, that presence in the shadows, that awareness that I was no longer invisible in the way I used to be. And once you feel something like that, you cannot unfeel it. You cannot go back to pretending the world is simple and safe and predictable. And I hated that he had been the one to show me, hated that he stood there like he had always known I would reach this point, that I would stop resisting and start seeing, because it made me feel like I was stepping into something already decided. And I forced myself to take a breath, slow and steady, grounding myself before I turned back to him fully. Then explain how it changes, I said, my voice quieter now but stronger in a different way, because this was no longer about denying him. It was about understanding what I was being pulled into, and his gaze held mine without hesitation, steady and unwavering, like he had been waiting for that exact question. They look for mistakes, he said, his tone even, measured, loose ends, things that do not belong. And I felt that word. Again, belong, echoing through everything he had said tonight, shaping it into something I could not ignore. And you think I am one of those things now? I said, not as a question, but as a realization, because that was the only way this made sense. And he did not correct me, did not soften it, just nodded once, a small, controlled movement that carried more weight than any explanation could. Then what are you? I asked. Because if I was something out of place, then he was something else entirely, something that fit into whatever this world was. And his expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, something deeper, something that felt like the truth beneath everything else. I am the one who decides whether you stay that way, he said. And the words should have felt like control, like a threat, but they did not land that way, not entirely, because there was no force behind them, no demand, just certainty, like he was describing a role he already occupied. And I let that sit for a moment, let it settle into something I could understand, because for the first time, this was not just about him blocking my path or watching from a distance. This was about something larger, something structured, something with rules I was only beginning to see. And I pushed myself away from the car slowly, stepping back into the open space between us, not closer, not further, just present, because standing halfway between leaving and staying was no longer enough. And if I walk away anyway, I said, holding his gaze as I spoke. If I ignore all of this and go back to my apartment and pretend nothing has changed, and I paused, not because I did not know what I was asking, but because I needed to hear it, needed to face it directly instead of circling around it. What happens then? And the silence that followed was not empty. It was deliberate, heavy with the answer before he even spoke, and when he did, his voice was softer than before, not weaker, just more precise, more certain. Then you become a problem no one has claimed, he said, and the simplicity of that sentence made it sink in deeper than anything else, heavier than anything I had spoken tonight. If I let you decide. And I stopped there, because that part mattered. That part defined everything that would come after, and his gaze did not waver, did not soften, just held steady as he answered. Then you are no longer unclaimed, he said, and the words settled into the space between us with a weight that changed everything. Because it was not ownership in the way I feared, not something taken by force, but something else, something chosen under pressure, something that meant stepping into his world instead of being caught outside of it. And I stood there for a long second, feeling the rain against my skin, hearing the distant city moving on like nothing had shifted at all, and I realized that whatever choice I made here would not take me back to who I was before. That version of my life was already gone, replaced by something I was only beginning to understand, and slowly, without breaking eye contact, I let my hand fall away from the car door completely, because for the first time since I stepped into this parking lot, I was not choosing where to go, I was choosing who I would stand with. The moment my hand dropped away from the car, something inside the space around us seemed to shift again, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been crossed that could not be stepped back over, and I felt it in the way the air settled, in the way the quiet no longer felt empty but watched, aware, and I knew without needing to turn that whatever had been lingering at the edges had noticed too, that my hesitation had turned into something else, something final, and I forced myself to stay still, to not look toward the shadows again because I already understood what I would find, or what I would feel, and instead I kept my focus on him, because if I was stepping into this, then I needed to understand the one person who claimed to stand between me and everything else. Then say it clearly, I said, my voice steady despite the way my pulse pressed harder against my ribs. What does staying with you actually mean? And for the first time since this began, he did not answer immediately, his gaze holding mine with a different kind of intensity now, not just assessing or controlling, but measuring, like he was deciding something important, something that would define everything after this moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. It means you are under my protection, he said, and the words landed heavier than I expected, not because of what they promised, but because of what they implied, that there was something real enough to need protection from, something organized enough that his claim would matter. And I let out a slow breath, processing that, turning it over in my mind because protection is never simple. It always comes with conditions, with expectations, with a cost that is not always spoken out loud. And what do you get in return? I asked, because that was the part that mattered, the part that would tell me whether this was truly a choice or just another version of being trapped. And his expression did not shift, did not harden or soften, just remained steady as he answered, your presence, he said, and for a second, that threw me completely, because it was not what I expected, not power, not leverage, not something obvious or transactional, just that, and I searched his face for something more, something hidden behind it. But there was nothing I could easily define, just that same quiet certainty that made everything he said feel like it had already been decided. That does not make sense, I said, because it did not in the way the world usually worked, not in the way I understood things, and a faint shift touched his expression, something almost like acknowledgement. It will, he replied, and there it was again, that promise of understanding later. That expectation that I would step far enough into this to see what he already saw, and I should have resisted that, should have rejected it outright. But instead I found myself holding on to it, because for the first time tonight, I was not just reacting, I was considering, weighing what I knew against what I had felt, and the truth was I could not ignore either anymore. And the realization settled into me slowly, solid and undeniable, that I was already part of this whether I chose to accept it or not. The only difference now was whether I faced it with awareness or walked into it blind, and I lifted my chin slightly, meeting his gaze fully, because if I was making this choice, then it would be mine, not something forced or taken. Then I stay, I said, the words quiet but clear, and the moment they left my lips, something shifted again, deeper this time, like the space itself acknowledged it. And his expression changed in a way I had not seen before, not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle easing of something held tightly beneath the surface, like a tension had been released, like a piece had finally fallen into place, and he inclined his head slightly, not a command, not a gesture of control, but something closer to acceptance. And then he stepped aside fully, not blocking anything now, not holding any space, just opening it. And for a second, I hesitated, not because I wanted to leave, but because the shift felt so complete, so final, like stepping forward would seal. Something I could not undo. And then I moved, not toward the car, not back toward the alley, but toward him, closing the distance by a single step. And that was enough to change everything. Because this was no longer about being stopped or redirected. It was about standing beside him by choice. And as I did, I felt it again, that awareness at the edges, that presence in the shadows. But it no longer felt the same, no longer distant and uncertain. It felt measured now, held back, like something that recognized a boundary it could not cross easily. And I exhaled slowly, steadying myself as I faced forward into whatever came next. Because this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I did not fully understand yet. Something darker, more complicated, but also something I had chosen to face. And as the rain continued to fall softly around us, and the city carried on without noticing the shift that had just taken place, one thought settled clearly in my mind. I had not just stepped into his world, I had allowed it to close around me, and there was no going back to who I was before.